Sean muy bienvenidos y bienvenidas. Sean muy bienvenidos y bienvenidas a este primer webinar de la serie de webinars que lleva el título Ecología Integral y Futuro Laboral, Reimaginando la Educación Universitaria, organizado por la red de Universidades SACRU junto a la vicerrectoría adjunta de Asuntos Internacionales de la Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. En primer lugar, queremos agradecer y saludar a nuestros invitados que abrirán esta primera sesión. La vicerrectora de Asuntos Internacionales de la Universidad Católica de Chile y miembro del Comité Ejecutivo de la Red de Colaboración Universitaria SACRU, señora Lilian Ferrer. Al profesor emérito de Estudios Ambientales del Oberlin College, Ohio, Estados Unidos, destacado escritor, promotor de la alfabetización ecológica y también ambientalista, profesor David Orr. Y al profesor de la Universidad Ramon Llull, en España, investigador principal en el Centro Global Codes y delegado de la Universidad para los Objetivos de Desarrollo Sostenible de la ONU, la Agenda 2030, profesor Óscar Mateos. Al comenzar este webinar, permítame darles dos explicaciones prácticas. En la parte baja de su pantalla, en Zoom, encontrarán un botón que les permite escoger la lengua en la cual desean escuchar el webinar. Tendremos traducción simultánea entre español e inglés, así que pueden seleccionar la lengua a su elección. Durante las presentaciones y la conversación, pueden plantear sus preguntas a través del botón asignado para eso en Zoom, en la parte baja de su pantalla. En la parte final de esta conversación, esas preguntas serán planteadas a nuestros dos panelistas. La iniciativa de esta serie de webinars surge de uno de los grupos de trabajo de la red SACRU, que tiene como título Universidades Católicas que se preocupan por la casa común y el bienestar de las personas, el cual toma como una de sus referencias importantes los principios propuestos por la encíclica Laudato Si, que populariza la noción de ecología integral en un intento por visibilizar la necesidad de soluciones sistémicas frente a la crisis ecológica y la interconexión entre los desafíos ambientales y sociales. A todos los panelistas de la serie de webinars les hemos planteado las mismas 4 preguntas que tienen que ver con cómo las universidades no solo están preparando a los estudiantes para el futuro, sino que están ayudando a generar ese futuro. En esta línea, buscamos ahondar en las transformaciones que se requieren en las universidades para hacer posible ese futuro desde el punto de vista de la formación que proponen, pero también a través de la investigación que desarrollan y el impacto que producen en sus sociedades. Los webinars tendrán un formato más conversacional, donde luego de una breve presentación de nuestros panelistas, se los invitará a conversar en torno a las 4 preguntas que les hemos planteado y otras que surjan también durante la conversación o de los asistentes a los webinars. Dejo con ustedes entonces a Lilian Ferrer, quien moderará el webinar del día de hoy. Muchas gracias.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all attendees today. It is such a pleasure to share with you this hour, and particularly with our guest speakers and all of you, of course. I would like to give a special thanks to the leaders of this webinar initiative, particularly to UC Chile and ACU, both universities that are part of SACRU and have been actively involved in SACRU Working Group number 2. Group which is delighted to explore more on our Catholic identity towards building a better home for all. Now I want to introduce our guest speakers. David Orr, he's Paul Senior Sears Distinguished Professor of Environmental Studies and Politics Emeritus and Senior Advisor to the President of Oberlin College. He's the founder editor of the journal Solutions and founder of the Oberlin Project, a collaborative effort of the city of Oberlin, Oberlin College, and private and institutional partners to improve the resilience, prosperity, and sustainability of Oberlin. He is the author of 8 books, including Dangerous Years, Climate Change, The Long Emergency, and The Way Forward, and Down the Wire, Confronting Climate Collapse, and co-editor of 3 others. He has authored over 200 articles, reviews, book chapters, and professional publications. Thank you, David, for being here. Óscar Mateos, he is currently Associate Professor of International Relations at Blanquema's School of Communication and International Relations at the Ramon Llull University. He is also the main researcher and coordinator of Global Codes, an emerging research group at the same school. He's leading different research projects on peace building and local ownership, the effects and the limits of the securitization international strategy, and the role of the Sustainable Development Goals in the international agenda. In 2019, he was appointed by the rector of Ramon Llull as his delegate for the United Nations 2030 agenda. To start our discussion, and again, giving thanks to you for being here with us, I would read the description of this first webinar. Higher education around the world is at an inflection point. The ongoing impact of COVID, along with broader technological, demographic, and political shifts, have accelerated the need to rethink the role and nature of the universities. This kind of transformation transcends discussion, goes beyond discussion of research, curriculum, learning delivery, and student support. It goes beyond questions of operating models and operational capacity. It invites us to think about how we can do better things, not simply how we can do things better. This series of webinars is thus focused on an exploration of the most profound questions of the meaning of the university, and with that, the very meaning of the university itself. Please share us in the next 6 minutes. What's your first reaction towards this description of the first webinar, and what attracted you to participate today with us? Maybe David can start.
Okay, well, can you hear me all right? Am I coming through clearly?
Perfect.
Well, listen, first of all, thank you very much for including me in this. And it's a real pleasure to be with all of you, and particularly Óscar, Mateos, Professor Mateos, and I appreciate your work. And so it's good to be here with all of you. Let me begin by saying that the university was originally conceived for different purposes than we now face. There are 8 billion of us. We're divided into 195 highly unequal nation states. We extract, process, and move trillions of tons of matter every year. We use about 18 terawatts of energy annually, mostly by burning a cube about 5 miles on edge of primeval goo, fossil fuels, every year. We're transforming the ecosphere everywhere to our disadvantage. We're in, if you were on a river trip, we're in the rapids of human history. And capsizing this little craft called civilization is not a remote possibility. The question for those of us in the business of education and propagating ideas and supposedly equipping young people for lives in this rapidly changing, uncertain world is what would you do What do we need to do? And if I change the question a bit, and if we shift to future generations looking back at our time, living in either the shadows or the sunlight of our legacy, what would our great grandchildren want us to do? And I think that they would likely ask us in this time to overcome our blindness to what is right before our eyes: the storms, the heat, the fires, the flood, the desecrated lands, extinctions, and injustices, and what these mean for their lives. Perhaps they would ask us to reckon with the possibility that, in the words of Reverend William Barber in the United States, our ideas are too puny for our circumstances, and to think more broadly and wisely about what it means to be a human. They would surely demand that we stop using the atmosphere as a dump for all of our fossil fuels and all of our waste, and the same with the oceans. They would ask us to preserve forests and rivers and soils and seas and mountains and life forms, grasslands. And certainly they would ask us to enlarge the democratic vista, the idea of democracy, to include their generations and perhaps other species, an intergenerational and interspecies democracy. They would certainly want us to create a durable foundation of well-considered personal rights and duties, tolerance for differences and dissent, and the government powers necessary for security and the laws to pass on to their generation. They would want us to leave behind a world in which words mean what they say, and the corruption of language that besets all democratic societies would be ended. And I think they would also want us to leave a world in which truth and reconciliation were possible, including across generational boundaries. None of these things are what the university typically was created to do. And so that's the great transformation that we have to make in terms of education. I'll deal with the specifics when we get into the 4 questions, but let me stop with that.
Thank you so much, David. Óscar, if you can share with us your first impression.
Sure. Well, first of all, I'd like also to appreciate and congratulate all the persons organized this very interesting webinar. And I must say that it's a real honor to be here sharing this panel with Professor David Orr. I think his work has been of great reference for many researchers and persons that are also trying to come up with different alternatives and ideas about this particular topic. So thanks very much. And I really appreciate this opportunity. With these initial thoughts, I'd like to start by considering one idea raised by the Portuguese sociologist Boaventura de Sousa Santos, when he says that we are not in an epoch of changes, but we are in an epochal change. And I think this idea that he also frames with the idea that we're in a paradigmatic transition, we're in a transition between paradigms. I think it's important to realize the amount, the complexity and the difficulty of the transformations that we were already undertaking before the pandemic started. So most of the challenges that we have ahead and we have in front of us were already pre-pandemic. And I think this is an important starting point. I think universities in the pre-pandemic moment were already being quite aware about the complexity that was lying ahead and the needs to develop different alternatives and different possibilities in this regard. And one important, I would say, platform, at least for most of European universities, had been the Agenda 2030 and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. I think the Agenda 2030 had fostered, before the pandemic started, the 2 years before, an important and an amazing path of revision of where the university should heading towards in this particular context, and had also fostered the need of mainstreaming the different challenges and transformations that the Agenda 2030 was underlining in this sense. So we had already an important roadmap in this sense before the pandemic started, and we had already an important global conversation that was challenging directly the university on what to do in the following years. But I completely agree with you, that with this initial paragraph that you mentioned, that the pandemic has probably accelerated and strengthened our perceptions about the urgency and the magnitude of the challenges that we have ahead. And probably, on the spite of the great human impact that the pandemic is having in all of our societies, the pandemic is going to be instrumental to show us that climate crisis is not something that was supposed to take place in the future, but that was something that already was transforming our lives. So probably the pandemic will help us to be much more aware and to take action in this regard about what to do in the short and the mid term. And I also agree with you that it goes much beyond the idea of just changing our curriculums or changing our research or whatsoever. It has a great ethical connotation, and it's leading us to reflect on a new set of, let's call it this way, post-pandemic set of values that can help us to really move forward to a new ethic of the integral ecology that really merges this divide that has existed so far between human societies and nature. Probably this pandemic will be a turning point in this regard, maybe not for everyone, but for the universities should be like a real platform to start moving much more convincing and in a much more urgent way than it has been done so far. I have other ideas or reflections that I'd like to develop afterwards.
Thank you so much, Óscar and David. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and with us, and thank you for raising these very important questions around what it means or how we could redefine being human, how we could use the platform of Agenda 2030 for moving forward as universities. And in those terms, I would like to ask you the first question. During this pandemic and amidst the many other challenges that we face as global citizens, such as the ecological crisis, what is the role of a university, of its staff and its students? I don't know, maybe if we could change now and maybe Óscar can start and then we move on to David.
Sure, I can start. I think I'd like to underline three things that are related to what I was already saying in my first insight. I think one of the great challenges that as universities we have at this particular stage is to know how to formulate the appropriate questions, because probably the tendency can be to respond in a simplistic manner or to give obsolete answers, outdated answers to the challenges that lie ahead of us. I think that would be our first intellectual challenge. Which are the questions we want to answer? Which are the key questions that as universities in our different like disciplines, we are like capable of coming up in order to reformulate and to reflect on our practice. Secondly, I think that the universities must be a key place for addressing like these global challenges that we have ahead. But I would say not only as a space for research and technological innovation, for example, as you were also like pointing out at the very beginning, or not exclusively as an institution capable of adapting to the changes, to the different changes that are like taking place. But I would say that above all, universities need to become a space for reflection, to think about where we are, how we got here, and from now on, where we want to go, what course to follow. And I think this is a profoundly like epistemological like challenge, but also an ontological one in this regard. To know from what values and conceptions of the present and the past we understand the construction of the future. I think that universities must be deeply committed to the construction of what I said before, this post-pandemic ethics. And lastly, I think this aim cannot be achieved from the top down with little or no student participation. I completely and fully agree with what Professor David Orr was pointing out about this cannot be exclusively like done by ourselves, which is a generation that it has been part of the problem that we are like trying to deal with. But we have to involve future generations, the students that are the ones that are completely suffering and are completely concerned about the effects of this climate crisis of the future. I think they have been the ones that have been socialized in this perception of a world that is tremendously like complex, and they have key elements from their own experience of analysis and reflection for the construction of any future solution that needs to be in the center of like the discussion.
Thank you so much, Professor Mateos. Professor Orr?
Well, Professor Mateos very eloquently framed the problem, and I agree with both statements he made. Let me expand this by saying that in terms of the university, the COVID-19 situation is a little bit like a flash of lightning on a dark night. It illuminated just for a moment the terrain of our time. And what we should have seen in that brief moment of a year, year and a half, or 2 years was that there were tragic flaws built into the way we had organized the global economy. And moving heavy things long distances for trade to keep things cheap for consumers would eventually mean you're moving light things like viruses long distances as well. That a pandemic was built into that particular model. It's interesting that the work on the new constitution in Chile is aiming to undo some of the work of the administration that wrote the last constitution that was tied also to an American university, University of Chicago, and the neoliberal economy. And so I make that point to say that we in the educated world are implicated in the crisis of our times. We're not innocent bystanders. We've unleashed ideas in the world as if they were truth, and there's suffering that happens. So the first order of business, it seems to me for universities everywhere, is to stop and think about how their underlying ideas match an ecological reality, that integral ecology that Pope Francis describes in Laudato Si. And I think I'd like to suggest a couple of points. The first is exactly what I said, that ecological disorder reflects a prior disorder in how we think and what we think about, which makes it central to every educator in the world in whatever discipline. Second, we are fast thinkers as humans, but we're very slow learners. We've known what we had to do to build a decent world for thousands of years. Love and compassion and those things, but it's hard for us to learn those. Third point, and this is implicit, I think, in Pope Francis' work, the idea of a system, implying our connectedness with all that ever was, all that is, and all that ever will be, is the most radical and necessary word and concept in our language. The fourth point, true self-interest, not the self-interest of consumers, but true self-interest, a broader self-interest, is inclusive, not exclusive. Another point is this, we assume, I think wrongly, that all knowledge is good and can be deployed without cost. I think that needs to be reconsidered in a world of complex feedback loops, leads, lags, surprises, black swan events, and long lapses between what we do and the consequences of what we do. Let me add two more. For students, what is a period of formal education? 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, whatever. Formal education is bounded as a curriculum, but true learning is a lifetime process. And so the university is, or all educational institutions are, I think, obliged to think how they create lifelong learners, not simply people who get degrees. And the last thing I would say is that the real problems, I think Professor Mateos and I are talking about, point out an underlying truth that part of the problem is not those in education, but the problem of education, considered in that larger framework that Pope Francis describes as integral ecology. In other words, I think it's time to rethink many things that we've taken for granted and many of the basics. And I say that as a loving critic of education, not an opponent of it. It's not that we need less education, but we need more education of, I think, a very different kind that connects us instead of divides us, and does not presume that economic growth is to be taken for granted, and domination of nature as well. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Professor Orr and Professor Mateos. And considering all the different ideas that you mentioned, like talking about post-pandemics, students' participation, integral ecology, lifelong learnings, rather than prepare for the future, how are you seeing universities prepare the future? What are the transformations that are required to enable this orientation? Professor Orr?
I didn't hear all of the question. Could you repeat that?
Yes, of course. Rather than prepare for the future, how are you seeing universities prepare the future, and what transformations are required to enable this orientation?
The university, let me read a statement that I wrote several weeks ago, and I'll distribute to you to pass out. But let me put it this way, and this is a statement I'm reading here. As a source of remedy for these issues, institutions of higher education, the university, is committed not to transformation, but to patching the flaws in a deeply flawed modern paradigm, on the wager that those flaws can be repaired and the modern paradigm carries the seeds of its own renewal. The educational system, with millions of students each year worldwide, billions of dollars of research funding, trillions of dollars in capital assets, operates with the assurance that goes with its assumed monopoly of solutions to what ails modern societies. It exists unmolested in the world of influence and money, as long as it doesn't threaten the prerogatives of capital and the underlying faith in economic growth and the domination of nature. Its very organization impedes non-trivial conversations across disciplines. Its financial dependency limits serious reckoning with ideas of justice, peace, interdependence, and ecology. It deals in what E.F. Schumacher once called convergent problems, not divergent problems. The former are linear and so amenable to scientific and technological solutions. The latter are more like dilemmas that are by definition unsolvable, but avoidable with foresight. Increasingly, our basic problems are those of the latter sort. They're divergent moral and political questions, refractory to mere logic and discursive reason. Reflection, simply mulling things over. The velocity or the speed of learning and research is too fast on some things, too slow on others, and too often college and university graduates become what writer Wendell Berry once described as itinerant professional vandals. My video went off, I'm sorry. There, I'm back. But I think that a university that took grandchildren and great-grandchildren and birds and animals and waters and hills and so forth seriously would be a very different enterprise. And I think that is the question. I don't presume to say how that should happen, but that it should happen.
Thank you, Professor Orr. Professor Mateos?
Yeah, I think that when reflecting on this idea of how universities prepare the future, I think, as I was like pointing out at the very beginning, my impression is that the pandemic has accelerated the social and political perception that global challenges before us affect our lives in a tangible way, and that is something that will become a turning point, probably. No, the Professor David Orr was mentioning this very interesting idea, no, that the pandemic illuminate for a moment, no, in a brief moment, no, our reality. And I think this is a very stimulating idea to understand if we will be able to learn from this first-person experience. We will be able to learn from that particular experience that has affected widely all of us, and which will be the role from now on, and what will be the lessons that the universities will learn from this particular challenge. Because I think until very recently, climate change was perceived, and also by the university, I would say, and especially in our Western countries, as a challenge for the future, as something that was going to take place in the future. But beyond some symptoms, such as maybe rising temperatures, it did not seem to really affect or transform the level of political awareness and action. And I myself devote some of my research time to analyze conflict dynamics in Africa. And I think in Africa, that was a different reality, because the societies were suffering at first hand since long time ago the effects of climate change, and they have become in the last decades and years much more resilient and aware of the problems that climate crisis entails, because they were suffering this particular problem. So this might become the possibility for us to really come out with something different. I think, as we were also saying, I think the pandemic is likely to accelerate the perception of the porosity and interdependence of our problems, to have this feeling of a joined human community. And probably one of the main sentences and a statement that has been repeated in the last months has been that we need, if no one is saved, or that someone is not safe, no one is safe. No? This is something that has been repeated. It's a pity that we have like reached this particular stage through an experience of suffering, because it would have been like much better to reach this point through a principle of solidarity. We knew that most of our societies, 85% of our like human population were in a very like difficult situation, and that it was 15% of the planet, the one that was consuming the bulk of the resources and creating this problem of climate crisis through this model of consumption. So I think that from that moment on, universities must become more resilient and able to adapt to the new context of uncertainty with innovative measures that would have taken years probably to implement not so long ago. And just like finishing what you were raising in the second part of your question about the transformations, I think that there are like three elements that are key to all these transformations. I think the first is the commitment to the time horizon. I think that 2030 is the last warning, the last chance to try to implement like ambitious policies in the coming years that will truly like make the university a sustainable institution with a neutral ecological footprint. And I think to this end, decisions and policies are needed that will quickly bring universities in line with decarbonization. I think the horizon of 2050 or 2040 is not feasible in this sense. The target date should be 2030. I think secondly, the university's vocation for education, research, knowledge, and impact must be aligned with the main global challenges. There is no other like priority if we believe that the planet is in danger and that the university is a crucial place for driving many of the technological, epistemological, and social changes we need. I think a university policy that mainstreaming and encouraging this mainstreaming will therefore be key. And finally, and coming back to the beginning again, I think the great challenge is not political or even economic. I think it's cultural, and it places the construction of an ethic aligned with both France's ideal of integral ecology as the most important and powerful tool to promote change. I think, as Francis points out in his encyclical Laudato Si, the shift from an anthropocentric to a biocentric conception, which integrates us as a humanity into a nature of which we are interdependent, is a basic change to counteract the values projected so far from this culture of excess and mass consumption. I think it's clear that if we believe that this new ethic makes sense, and I agree completely with Professor David Orr, I think we have to rethink the current economy, which is based on a very crematistic idea that has little respect for the planet. If we continue to put economic growth at the center, no matter who falls, we will be insisting on answers that we know are obsolete. I think in this sense, we cannot entrust everything to the technological dream. And I think that's one of the main problems, to consider that the technological dream, the innovations in the future will sort out or will solve everything. I think that's a mistake. I think the rest is still about overcoming a production and a consumption model that has reached its ceiling.
Thank you so much, Professor Mateos and Professor Orr. And now that you mentioned this excess of consumption, and at the same time you were suggesting that we follow through with solidarity, and and there is a question actually from one of the attendees. What should be the connection between universities and the different businesses and private companies in front of this social ecological crisis? Which are the risks and what are the challenges of putting together universities and these organizations? Professor Orr? No?
I didn't hear all the question, but let me begin by, I think I know what you're going toward. And let me make a couple of points here. One is that I completely agree with Professor Mateos that if I had to say it a little bit differently, I would say that there are no or very few accidents in the world. That with climate change, loss of species, ocean acidification, poverty, violence, this is the working out of the rules of the system that were imposed on the world. This is the logical result. These are not accidents. These are predictable kinds of things. Secondly, I agree wholeheartedly with the urgency of Professor Mateos' selection of 2030 as a definitive date to aim for lots of reasons. And I think that what that suggests is a goal for the universities and for all educators is to create a new generation of incredibly smart, talented young people who are dangerous to the system of violence, power, domination of nature, and who come prepared to be radicals in the real sense of the word. Radical means to get to the root of the problem, but understand that we're not tinkering with the boundaries of the system. We're not aiming to make marginal changes. Now, the role of the university and all higher education, you think of what the assets are. First of all, they've got millions of students. They've got money. They've got convening power. They can pull people together. They've got research capacity. They've got incredibly smart, dedicated, talented people. And what I think needs to happen is a different framework that harnesses students and research and faculty and the assets of the university to different ends. And let me describe a project that we have underway that involves 4 universities and other organizations around the United States and hopefully around the world. Our focus is on the preservation of democracy and the enhancement of democracy and climate change and the convergence of those two. And we're bringing in other organizations and businesses and foundations and so forth. But we're making an assumption that climate change is the result of a failure of democracy. Nobody voted for it. Nobody would have wanted it. But there was no mechanism by which public could be informed and express an opinion about it. And then the second assumption is that if we on planet Earth are to surmount the crisis, it will be because we've been able to tap into the creative powers and devotion and efforts and energies of literally billions of people around the Earth that are willing to roll up their sleeves and work towards solutions. And so these two are converging around a project, we're calling it the State of American Democracy Project, but really it applies to Europe. Part of our goal over the next year or two is to engage European universities and organizations in the same, in the project. This is a global dialogue of how we do the public business in a way that can be sustained, it's durable, it's fair, it's beautiful, it's good for grandchildren and penguins and elephants. A life-preserving effort on behalf of all of humanity.
Thank you, Professor Mateos.
Yeah, first of all, I would say that one important aspect that has to do with the role of universities and the role of business companies in this regard is that we have a new global landscape that has allowed in the last 2 decades to integrate many more like actors in global decisions. We are not just in the states like in a state like global governance, where states or national states are the only ones or that have the capacity to shape our global political decisions. Of course, there are like countries that have a great hegemonic and powerful capacity of shaping the final decisions that are taken at the high level. And also increasingly, business companies have become a very powerful actor also, even sometimes in shaping also democratic and political decisions in this sense. So we are in a very different global landscape where non-state actors like global businesses have the capacity of shaping things. And also universities, although probably they have more marginal role in some of these decisions, have also been invited to this global discussion about climate change agreements, for instance, or other type of decisions, at least to have their say and their opinion about that. So let's take advantage of this more plural, global governance that we have in front of us, and where many other voices are listened in this sense. It's true that some of these voices are the ones that at the end, this is not a democratic global governance, it's a very asymmetric global governance, but at least it's a little bit more plural. Secondly, I think the risk for business companies, but also for universities in this regard, is greenwashing. I mean, we are not talking here about a cosmetic change. I mean, corporate social responsibility has been absolutely key for many business companies in the last decades. And I think many companies have been moving forward in many senses since this type of new levels have been mainstream in their policies and their views. But probably what has been done up to now is not enough to deal with the magnitude of the challenge that we have ahead. We have to be careful of, in this post-pandemic context, to greenwash some of these decisions, or just to make the Agenda 2030 or other type of agreements as a cosmetic change, but not really meaningfully changing our policies and our decisions. It would be absolutely, in this sense, ingenious to do that, because at the end, and this is the last thing that I want to say, what we have acknowledged with this crisis is the great level of interdependence where we are, and the great transnational nature that is affecting our lives. So all these actors, universities and business companies, have to take the lead in really coming up with very transformative and innovative policies that really want to tackle the root causes of the problems that we have ahead.
Could I interrupt and say something?
Yes, of course.
Professor Mateos said that really well, and I want to underscore that. I want to underscore two things that stand out in his remarks. One is, earlier, he talked about extending the time horizon, so we're not so focused on the near term, but the longer term. And so were we to extend that time horizon, let's say that we would say that future generations, say 4 or 5 generations out, actually have rights. And so let's think of democracy as something that's an intergenerational democracy, not just the current generation, which can act in ways that destroy the possibilities of life, happiness, and health for future generations. And the second comment is this, and this is an elaboration of Professor Mateos' point. Pope Francis repeatedly in Laudato Si calls for a different politics and different governance. And climate change, for one thing, certainly in the United States, represents the most massive dereliction or failure of power in human history. We knew a long time ago that burning fossil fuels would destroy the climate balance that permitted life to flourish during the Holocene. And yet we let that go on. And I can't think that there's no greater dereliction of power and so forth. Pope Francis' response is that we have to rethink politics and governance. And I agree that eventually, agree with Professor Mateos, that eventually this has to result in a different culture, different people with different priorities. But it will need, to meet that 2030 deadline, we need fast action, which can only be done by people in power that understand the truth and begin to build that. The last thing I would say is this, to underscore Laudato Si, I think we need prices that tell us the truth about what it is we do in the world. And the problem with the COVID situation was we were buying lots of things that the price didn't tell us the truth. They were cheap on the store shelf. But when you added up all the costs to indigenous peoples, to ecosystems, to climate stability, pollution, the cost, these were very expensive things. And we assumed that we could build an economy in which prices, the market price, was adequate. It was nowhere near adequate. And so we've developed, if I use the metaphor of a boat pushing a bow wave in front of it, we push a bow wave of debt off onto other generations. And the debt of climate change is part of that. This is a moral issue, as Pope Francis would say. So that's my comment.
Thank you so much, Professor Orr, for your comments. Actually, I mean, as a faculty member at the university, all the things that you mentioned make absolute sense. And at the same time, it poses huge challenges. I mean, you're talking about a life-preserving culture, you're talking about transformative policies, and at the end, you mentioned fast action from people who really understand the truth. And sometimes that at the universities, we are a little slow in terms of responding or giving answers to social challenges. So in that sense, and considering we are almost at the end of the webinar, I would like to make a question regarding, considering that SACRU is an alliance for Catholic universities and research Catholic universities, how do you see religious beliefs and spirituality, how that has a role in giving the universities the possibility to actually confront and give an answer to socio-environmental challenges nowadays? What would be your suggestion for Catholic universities?
I didn't hear the last part of the question. Your sound is cutting off.
Professor Orr, we are SACRU, is an alliance of Catholic research universities.
Okay.
So what would be your suggestions for us to confront this challenge of actually getting into a life-preserving culture at our universities, considering spiritual and religious values?
That's a good question. There's no short answer to it. Let me start though and say two things. One is going back to something I said earlier. The operating assumption of universities, whether Catholic or Protestant or secular, is that all knowledge is good and the more we have is better. And so that led us to understand a great deal about how to kill each other cheaply. A good bit of the research effort, certainly in American universities, has been supportive of this military industrial complex. And so we know a great deal about how to blow cities up, but not how to make great cities that are sustainable and operate within sunshine and so forth. We know a great deal about how, and part of the research goes on the other side of the campus, is how to protect the rights of capital, for example, but not how to create a just society. And so the first question, your question begs us to ask, what do we need to know to create the kind of world that Pope Francis described in Laudato Si? What do we need to know? And science alone doesn't answer that. Most of these are, in my comment about convergent and divergent, these are divergent issues. These are dilemmas, they're moral issues, and they involve serious moral philosophical thinking, the kind of thinking that can cost you something. It's dangerous thinking. And so the first question is, I think, what is it we need to know? And I would not presume to say that. But if you look through a university catalog or college catalog, what part of that is trivial? What part of it is dangerous? what part of it is absolutely necessary. And I say that, I want to make one caveat. I don't think there is anything necessarily trivial. You can teach literature in a way that's totally trivial or totally important. It's how it is taught and against what kind of context. The second thing I would say is this. I want to go back to this, the end product. When students graduate from a Catholic university or Oberlin College or any place else, what is it that they do in the world? What have we given them in the way of ideas that shape a life worth living toward a planet that we can preserve? And so that is a different kind of thing. The busyness of university life, as I've seen it around the world, incredibly busy, taking the talents of great young faculty and dividing them up and making them publish a lot of stuff that doesn't need to be published early in their careers. The barriers we separate disciplines, and we need a large conversation about these are big issues. I need people who can think at right angles to their professional specialization. So specialization is good, but so also is the idea of connecting fields of knowledge. And so I think the incentive structure in higher education needs to reflect these larger goals of Pope Francis. Integral ecology is a big subject, embraces about everything you could imagine. So how do we create big thinkers, or thinkers that acknowledge the largeness of it all and the precariousness of it all, the dangers that we face?
Thank you so much, Professor Orr. Professor Mateos?
Yeah, I completely subscribe what Professor Orr was saying. I would say that Catholic universities have the possibility, if they haven't done yet that particular exercise, but maybe to reflect on a spirituality that considers probably three elements that are growing, that are probably coming up after this particular context of pandemic, and maybe much before. I would say that the first aspect to reflect on from this spirituality is the idea of progress. How the idea of progress has been built up so far, and how, and this has been something underlined by Pope Francis, the idea of limit. And I think this idea of progress has been a misleading idea that probably has been reshaping the relevant aspects that should be constituting our lives. I think this pandemic and this whole global conversation in the midst of this climate crisis lead us to think the idea of progress from different perspectives, not from the idea of economic growth, but from the idea of sustainability, human well-being, the idea of limit. I think that's a crucial aspect, no? How to shape this post-materialist, post-consumist culture. The second thing I think is the idea of empathy. I think at least in our Western societies, and probably you in other Latin American societies, your experience is different. But here, from the European perspective and our Eurocentric perspective that we always have, yes, we can have atoms of solidarity with other countries that are suffering humanitarian problems. But at the end, these are not shaping the core of our policies, and we are not really assuming that we need to change things in terms of consumption, for instance, and in terms of privileges that have to do with consumption that we have acquired. And probably empathy has been a first-hand experience in this particular pandemic. We have experienced, probably as never in our lives, in many generations, the feeling of uncertainty, and which is a feeling and is an experience that many people in Africa experience every day since long time ago. And I think this can also constitute a great element in what we call this spirituality. And finally, I think that we have to reflect on how to slow down this dynamic of acceleration that this digital world has also created, because this is also a transformative element in our like culture and our spirituality. How to counter like this world of screens, of images, of accelerated like news, where we don't even have time to think and reflect on ourselves, on our society, and to put and to like break up this pattern of individualistic like societies. So how to slow down this great level of acceleration, I would say, might be the third pillar of this like spirituality.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Professor Mateos and Professor Ohr. It has been such a pleasure to listen to your words. And we're, as a faculty member at the Catholic University, I will keep in mind this important issues around empathy, solidarity, changing our culture, building a better world, and actually working towards creating a world, the one that it's described by Pope Francis in Laudato Si. I think that we have many answers in there, and maybe we need to go more in depth and analyze it better and try to find answers and raise questions about what we're doing at the moment, and that you challenge us to work on that, raise the correct questions, and move forward into creating better citizens for the future. So thank you so much, and thank you so much, Ramon, for inviting Professor Ohr and Professor Mateos to this webinar. I give you the word now.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. An honor to be here.
Damos entonces muchas gracias al profesor Ohr y al profesor Mateos por sus sugerentes e inspiradoras ideas y reflexiones. También muchas gracias a Lilian Ferrer por haber liderado la conversación de hoy. El webinar de hoy estará disponible en las redes sociales de la Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile y también de la red SACRU. Les vamos a hacer llegar más información para acceder al webinar. Agradecemos también la participación de todos ustedes y de todas ustedes hoy día. Sabemos que quedaron preguntas pendientes y entonces los invitamos y las invitamos a nuestro próximo webinar, que se va a realizar el día 15 de junio, martes a las 8:30 de Chile, y que va a contar con la participación de Mary Evelyn Tucker, de Yale University y del Foro de Religión y Ecología, y también de Juan Carlos Muñoz, que es el director del Instituto de Desarrollo Sustentable de la PUC Chile. Así que les damos muchas gracias y esperamos verlos y verlas el día 15 de junio.